Let's go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 5. Gospel of Mark and chapter 5. Last week we saw in chapter 4 Jesus' power over nature, over the natural. Here we'll see Jesus' power over the supernatural. So let's go ahead and read Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. A bit of a longer text today. It says, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me.' For he was saying to him, 'Come out of the man, you unclean spirit.' And Jesus asked him, 'What is your name?' He replied, 'My name is Legion, for we are many.' And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. And they begged him, saying, 'Send us to the pigs. Let us enter them.' So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, 'Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you.' And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled." This is God's word. Well, I'm titling this message, "Jesus versus a Legion," because we're confronted with a description of demonic possession unlike we've seen before. Hollywood frequently tries to depict demonic possession or what demons do, what they look like, when their activity, often with creative liberties. But the question for us is, what is the spiritual realm, specifically the demonic realm, actually like? Because this, as we've been saying so far through the book of Mark, this is eyewitness history. This is the account of people who were there. And so what can we learn from this and from Jesus' power over this realm? Well, I want to look at 4 things with you today. Here's the first one: the reality of the spiritual realm. The reality of the spiritual realm. And we have to be clear on this. We're presented here with some chilling facts about the spiritual realm. In fact, this story contains the lengthiest and most graphic description of demonic oppression in the entire Bible. This man here who is suffering from this has supernatural strength. You'll see that chains couldn't contain him. Shackles are no match for him. He's crying out. He's harming himself. He's cutting himself. This is not a pretty picture of what is happening to this man. And you'll notice how the town tried to help him in the past. Did you notice that? They tried to bind him. They tried to shackle him up. No one had the strength to subdue him. And so basically the implication you get is he's just sent away into the mountains. They try physical helps for this man with a spiritual condition. And I point that out because there's a similar danger that exists for us today, especially for those of us educated in the medical field. And that danger is to reduce everything to the physical or the psychological realm. Now, again, as always, I've said this before, I'm grateful for the advancements and the technology that we have in the medical field. My wife's a nurse, so I'm not anti-medical field. However, we've gotten to the point where we have a label for everything. We have a physical diagnosis for everything. And that's dangerous because if this man were to go to a doctor today, if he, time traveled a couple thousand years and went to a doctor, he would almost certainly be diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, or it used to be called multiple personality disorder. See, the DSM-5 is the diagnostic tool that is used. It's the standard in the psychological world. And I want you to listen to the criteria of this dissociative identity disorder. Listen to the first one. It says, disruption of identity characterized by two or more distinct personality states, which may be described in some cultures as an experience of possession. I sense a little bit of condescension there. In some cultures, you might as well just say some primitive cultures, they might call that possession. Now, I'm not saying throw out everything that they have to say. If you're a psychology major, I'm not trying to bash you or trying to do any of that. I don't want you to think I'm a loony either. However, what I am saying is putting a label on everything has really muddied the waters. And the thing of the matter is, a lot of people, they say, well, science can explain everything. We can explain everything physically. There's a reason it's the DSM-5, meaning the 5th edition. They're always having to change what they found. They're always having to update it and say, well, we were wrong here. The reality is, our world is more complex than we realize. And the second we start giving physical explanations to everything, or on the flip side, the second we start giving spiritual explanations for everything, we get ourselves into trouble. We need great wisdom to navigate the issues of our day. We as people, our world is much more complex than we realize. We can't simply reduce it to the physical realm. See, the Bible distinguishes between physical and spiritual conditions. I don't know if you've noticed that as we've gone through. Sometimes we tend to look down upon ancient people. They didn't know as much as we do. We know now what these things are, these conditions. But the Bible understands that there's complexity to these issues. Now listen, I don't know where everyone's at today or what worldview you came in with, but let me challenge you. If you came in here and you say science can explain everything, it's just the physical realm, you know where you're really going to have issues? Is when you encounter evil. And I mean real evil, depth of evil. You know where this was really made evident in recent history? It was World War II. After World War II, after Hitler took his own life, he was out of the picture, the war ended. What ended up happening was a lot of the high-ranking German officials were arrested that were involved in the Nazi regime. And the world did something that was unprecedented. They put them all on trial. Basically, the world versus these individuals. And they were called the Nuremberg trials, and there was actually a movie that just came out last year. It was pretty decent, that studied this. But here's what's interesting. What ended up happening during the Nuremberg trials is there was an American psychiatrist who developed this relationship with Hitler's second in command. And he was fascinated because he was talking to this man and he was like, this man seems very ordinary. How could he be capable of these horrendous, horrendous acts? He tried to get inside his mind and tried to understand how he could do these things. And in the movie, there was a quote that struck me. This psychiatrist was talking with another American, and listen to what he said. He said, if we could psychologically define evil, we could make sure nothing like this ever happens again. See the issue? Trying to find a physical, a psychological explanation for the evils of the world. They were stumped. They couldn't understand, how could these ordinary people commit these atrocities? When in reality, the fact of the spiritual realm the fact that there are demonic forces at work helps explain and make sense of the depths of evil that we see. The fact that there are forces of darkness at work. And that's what the Apostle Paul reminds us of in Ephesians chapter 6. He says, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." When you get a grasp on that our world is not merely the physical, that there's a spiritual realm, that there are demonic forces at work, dark forces at work, you'll start to make sense of the chaos that exists around us and has existed around us. Demonic influences can not only affect an individual, but certainly can influence society, affect systems and government, and you absolutely see that today. Now listen, I could get into this more in depth if we wanted to, but let me just caution you before I move on, because there's much more to cover here. There's two extremes you want to avoid when it comes to demonic forces and being understanding of the spiritual realm. C.S. Lewis helps us here. He says there's two extremes to avoid. One is to disbelieve in their existence, which is what we just looked at. To say, there's no such thing as demons or the spiritual realm, that's nonsense. But the other, he says, is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. In other words, what you don't want to start doing is finding a demon under every nook and cranny of your life, saying, "Oh, this bad thing happened to me, that must have been a demon," or "That's a demon." You can't just start pointing it out everywhere. We have to be discerning. We're to know they're there, they exist, and we also have to be careful not to ignore their existence. Our world is much more complex than we realize at first. So that's the reality of the spiritual realm. Secondly, we see the influences of the spiritual realm. Okay, if we've established that these forces are there and they exist, how do they operate? Well, we see a couple of examples of that here. Let's look at the demoniac more in depth. This poor guy, man, the things that this poor man went through. I heard some pastors and writers say that they wonder if this man was kind of like a household name. And if parents use this man like a threat to their kids, you better be good, little Johnny, otherwise we're going to send you up to Old Legion up in the hills, right? I don't know. Kind of like the old man in Home Alone, right? You stay far, far away from him. You keep your distance. You watch him from a window, but you don't get up close. This poor man's become untouchable. He's dangerous. He's violent. The implication you get here, did you notice? I think it was verse 3. No one could bind him anymore. In other words, this man's condition was gradual. It got worse over time. And there's probably some application there, isn't there? The fact that evil or sin, when left unchecked, can just grow and grow and grow, can become gradually worse, to the point that not even chains could bind this man. No solution worked. Here's the other thing, though, that's sad about this man. The ironic thing is he is incredibly powerful, isn't he? You see the shackles that he can just, no big deal. And yet all at the same time, this man is completely powerless. He's enslaved, spiritually speaking. Physically, he's powerful, but spiritually, he's enslaved. And isn't that the truth about sin? How sin promises so much, promises to give you so much, and then when you give into it, you're enslaved to it. This man's life is literally in shambles and in pieces. He hardly has an identity anymore. Do you notice verse 10? Verse 10 puzzled me because I'm like, what is happening here? There's all kinds of pronouns being thrown around. It says, and he begged him, meaning the demoniac begged Jesus, earnestly not to send them, meaning the demons, out of the country. Why does this man care where the demons go? Well, it's because sadly, this man's identity has become almost warped with the demonic activity within him. It's almost like his wishes are their wishes at this point. Why have they done this to this poor man? What's the agenda here? What's the goal of the demons? Well, that leads to a very important point. What is demonic activity? What's their goal? Well, it's this. It's to distort and destroy the image of God in humanity. That's the sad reality we see here, to distort and destroy the image of God in humanity. What are the aspects of the image of God in humanity? Let me just give you a couple that pertain here. Saying that humanity is made in the image of God does not just mean that we look like God. God is spirit, okay? That's not the idea. There's aspects of who we are that reflect aspects of who God is. So a couple, for example, we are rational creatures like God is. Animals can't think rationally. They don't have cognitive abilities, problem solving the way we do, because we're made in the image of God. We're relational creatures. We're made for relationship. God is relational by nature, the Trinity, 3 in 1. He's relational by nature, and then so are we. And you see, there's more to it than that, but you see how these particular aspects of that are being distorted and destroyed in this man. His rational thinking is distorted. His relational aspect, he's out in the tombs, in the mountains, apart from everybody. And isn't that how demonic activity works today? To try and create friction in relationships, whether that's in the family, within churches, within society. The demonic goal is to destroy what God has made good, and we see a prime example of that in this man. But what other influence do we see here? That leads me to me, the most disturbing part of this passage. As if this wasn't disturbing enough to look at this demon-possessed man, here's what I want you to see, is what's juxtaposed with this man, what's put side by side with this man. You see the obvious influence of Satan with the man, but the scary thing is, the town is just as under Satan's influence as well, because they're blinded. The crowd wants nothing to do with Jesus. They want him gone. Why? Was it the power of Jesus? Well, certainly that was probably part of it. Was it the fact that now a large amount of money is now bobbing in the sea, dead? That's probably part of it too. But whatever you want to specifically point to, what stands behind all that is the fact that their hearts were hardened and their eyes were blinded. Isn't this tragic? The fact that this town wished that Jesus had just never come. Like, Jesus, our town was fine before you came along. We would have rather that you had never came. We had it under control. We had old Legion up in the tombs. We had him under control. He was far away. Jesus, please leave. It's tragic. How does this apply to us? Because you might be wondering, you might be saying, I don't fall into either one of these categories. How does this apply to us? Well, let me address the question that's probably certainly passed through your mind at some point so far. Can a Christian be demon-possessed? I'm not going to leave you in suspense. The short answer is no. In fact, this kind of possession that we see here is probably pretty rare. This is a rare thing even for someone who's not a Christian. But don't allow that to let your guard down. Because just because you cannot be possessed by demons as a Christian does not mean you cannot be oppressed or influenced by demons. That is absolutely possible for a Christian. I've been reading this book over the last month or so and trying to take it in chunks because it's so good and it's so dense. I would highly recommend it. It's called The Christian in Complete Armor by William Gurnall. It's 500 years old, so get the modernized version. But I love how he says it. He says, if you are a saint, you do not need to fear that Satan will infiltrate your soul. God will not permit it. But the devil can and does attack along the borders of your faith. Though you are not the proper subject of his power, you are and always will be the chief object of his wrath. Let me say that again. Though you are not the proper subject of his power, meaning you're not under the reign of Satan, he doesn't have control over you, but you are and always will be the chief object of his wrath. You have a target on your back, fellow Christian. Satan would love nothing more than to get you entangled, to get you to sin. And so I said earlier, we have to be cautious of kind of the two extremes, right, of thinking too much of Satan or thinking not of him at all. But this is a reminder here, this is a real fight, especially for a new Christian. If you've just become a Christian, you might be bombarded, and it might shock you, and you say, well, I didn't expect things to be like this. I'm tempted to sin all the time. What is going on? This is a real fight. And that's why Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5, be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Be watchful, fellow Christian. Well, thirdly, let's look at some good news. That's some heavy points so far. Let's see, thirdly, Jesus' power over the spiritual realm. Jesus' power over the spiritual realm. Verse 7, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, meaning the demon-possessed man, what have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. This is interesting. He says, I adjure you by God. I mentioned earlier Hollywood and how they try and depict demon possession and exorcisms. Well, one of the things you often see are these formulas, right, that they use to try and cast demons out of people. They recite a certain thing to kind of draw out the demon. Is that what's happening here? I don't know. Maybe this is some, really bad attempt of the demons to try and get power over Jesus. But I love what Jesus says. He says, what's your name? Right? You're going to try and gain mastery over me. What's your name? And the response is quite chilling. The man says, Legion, for we are many. A legion, a Roman legion at the time, was about 6,000 soldiers. Point being, there's literally an army of darkness staring Jesus in the face. That'll send chills up your spine. 6,000. Trying to thwart Jesus, trying to gain power over Jesus, trying to stop God's purposes. And yet at Jesus' word, at his very presence, they all cower in fear. They tremble. They're begging him not to torment them. I want you to see two things here that we learn. Number one, see what tremendous power Christ demonstrates. See what tremendous power Christ demonstrates. Now, this passage comes right on the heels of what we saw last week, where Jesus calms a storm. And that's probably intentional, because what we're seeing here, well, it certainly is intentional. What we're seeing here, again, is the authority and the power of Jesus. Remember last week with the calming of the storm, I said how it kind of compares to the story of Jonah. And how with Jonah, the sailors, when there was a storm on the sea, the sailors came to Jonah and they told him to call on a higher power. Call on your God. But then we said last week how Jesus doesn't have to call on a higher power to still a storm. He is the higher power. He has the authority to calm the sea. The same thing here. Jesus doesn't need some exorcism formula to cast out these demons or call on a higher power to cast out these demons. No, Jesus is the higher power. He has that authority himself, which is incredible considering the amount of demons staring him in the face. It made me think of that old, Greek mythology, the 300 Spartans against however many soldiers, right? That makes that look like child's play compared to what Jesus is doing here. This is 1 verse 6,000 demons, and it's no contest. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, there's another level to this. There's basically 4 levels of uncleanliness that's going on here. You remember in Leviticus and the Levitical law, there was that clean and unclean distinction in the Old Testament? And you didn't want to touch anything unclean or do anything that would make you unclean. Well, there's 4 levels of that here with Jesus. Number 1, he's in Gentile territory. Strike 1. Number 2, this guy's got unclean spirits. Strike 2. The fact that this man lives among the tombs, has contact with the dead, that would make you unclean, so that's strike 3. And then, by the way, there's herds of pigs. Jews didn't eat pigs. That was considered unclean. Strike 4. And yet it is no contest for Jesus. Jesus conquers all of that without breaking a sweat. See, what we said before is the demonic activity is to distort and destroy. What's Jesus' agenda? To restore and to heal. Didn't we see that with the storm? Jesus shows his power over nature, that he can calm the storm. And then here, same thing. He can restore this man. He can conquer any demon or number of demons that comes his way. How does he do it, though? Well, the demons make a really odd request, don't they? Why pigs? Why do they want to be sent into pigs? Let's just point out the obvious. This seems a little strange. And yet, all at the same time, it teaches us an incredible truth. See, demonic activity seeks to destroy God's creation. We said that. And it really wants to do that with humanity. But Jesus will not let that happen. Pigs, however, he will let that happen. Why? Well, here's the second thing. See what tremendous value Christ puts on a soul. See what tremendous value Christ puts on a soul. I don't know about you, but I like to try and put myself inside the story and think what all the characters must be thinking and feeling. Can you imagine being these herdsmen? I mean, seriously, imagine that. If you're this herdsman, you're entrusted with taking care of these pigs, and there they go. Anyone seen videos on Facebook or YouTube of where someone makes a catastrophic mistake at work and it's caught on video, and you just feel so bad for the guy? Like a forklift in a warehouse, he accidentally bumps a shelf, and then they just start going like dominoes over half the warehouse, and you're like, how does he explain that one? And that's what I think here. How does this guy explain this? Go back to the owner. You lost 2,000 pigs? How did that happen? Demons? How do you explain that? And sure enough, that's what he does. I don't know what the conversation was like, but he goes back, and so that the town comes out. They got to see what's going on. All these pigs are bobbing in the sea. What must that have looked like? I don't know. But the town now sees two things. Okay, the town comes out. They see two things. On the one hand, they see the healed man. And they see three things about him that we're told. Number one, he's clothed. I didn't mention this before, but Luke's gospel tells us he wasn't clothed. So now he's clothed. That's weird. That's not how he usually is. Secondly, he's sitting. Clearly, he couldn't sit still before, so that's weird. The town is, this is interesting. And then thirdly, what do they see? He's in his right mind, and clearly he wasn't before. So on the one hand, they see this miraculous, complete healing. This man has been made whole. That's what they see on the one hand. On the other hand, what do they see? A lot of money that has just been lost. 2,000 pigs, a lot of money, a lot of food. So they see a miraculous healing and a lot of money lost, and what do they say? Jesus, please leave. This is pretty sad, isn't it? Between a bunch of pigs, some money, and this man's soul, they say, we would have rather that you just left things the way they were. But see, from Jesus' point of view, it was worth it. Jesus would take that trade every time. Between a human soul and a bunch of pigs, Jesus will take the human soul every time. A human soul is so precious to Jesus. And if you're not convinced of that, we have proof, because later on in the Gospel of Mark, the only other time we see the word tomb in the Gospel of Mark? It's when Jesus himself is put there. See, this man was naked, and in the tombs, Jesus one day would be stripped naked, hung on a cross, and put in the tomb. That's how much a soul means to Jesus. That's how much your soul means to Jesus. But he didn't stay in the tombs. See, he came out of the tomb victorious so that you too could come out of the tomb, spiritually speaking. So that you could be set free from sin, just like this man was. I mean, really, if you're a Christian here today, this is kind of our story that we're seeing here. The way this man was set free from the reign of sin and death, so were we. Do you see how precious your soul is to Jesus? Have you given yourself to him? Does your soul belong to him? If not, this text makes it abundantly clear that you are still under the reign of sin and Satan. So run to Christ. Be healed like this man. See his power over all demonic activity and be healed. Don't resist him. Don't hold the posture of the crowd. Be healed. See his power. Well, fourthly and finally, I love this part of the story. Jesus' purpose for the healed. Jesus' purpose for the healed. I almost made this its own message because there's so much here. But we'll give it one point here today. Jesus' purpose for the healed. Did you notice that the healed man is the only one who does not get his request? The one who is obedient here, the one who wants to follow Jesus, doesn't get his request. Isn't that interesting? It's a stark reminder to us that sometimes the worst thing for you is getting what you want. That's what we see with these three requests. Sometimes the worst thing for you is getting what you want, especially if you're not yet a Christian. One of the worst things that God can do for you is to let you have your own way. Romans chapter 1 is a really heavy chapter, the second half of it at least, where 3 times it describes people that want to go their own way, away from God. And you know what it says 3 times? God gave them up. It's a startling reminder that God says sometimes, you want to go your own way? You want nothing to do with me? Okay, I'm not going to force you. Have it your way. These townsfolk, they say, Jesus, we don't want you here. And he says, okay. So we have the demons who begged him to let them go into the pigs. He did. We have the town who begs him to leave. He does. Then we have the healed man beg Jesus to let him go with him, but he does not. Why? Well, let's be clear. Jesus is not letting him come physically with him. That's what is happening here. It's not that Jesus won't let him be a Christian. Okay, that's not what's happening. This man wants to physically go with Jesus, and Jesus says no. Jesus had a different purpose for this man. And it actually teaches us something that some of us, we may need to hear. And that is, Jesus may not call you to do what you want to do initially. When you become a Christian, God may call you to something unexpected. You may want to do something for Jesus, and he may either say not yet or not at all. That's what he did for this man. Martin Lloyd-Jones tells the story of a man who came to him one time. Martin Lloyd-Jones was an old pastor in London in the previous century. But a scientist, a very good scientist, came up to him and said, I feel called to the ministry. I really want to do ministry and go into ministry. But as Lloyd-Jones got to know him, he realized he didn't have the giftings for ministry. And so he had to have a conversation with him. That's probably a very hard conversation to have, where he said, I don't think you're called to ministry. But this man wouldn't listen. He said, no, I am called to ministry. And so what did he do? He went into ministry. And so for the next 7 years, this man struggled between 3 different churches as he entered into ministry. Why? The Lord never called him to that. And so what happened? Well, at the end of the 7 years, he came to the realization, I don't think the Lord has called me to ministry. So what did he do? He went back to being a scientist, and he thrived because that's what the Lord had gifted him to do and called him to do. And so the Lord may not always call us to the things that we desire. That's what happened with this man. The healed man wanted to be with Jesus. He didn't want to leave his side, but Jesus says, I have something better for you. It may not look like it right now. You may not think it right now, but I have work for you to do elsewhere. And I love the fact that this man does it. He obeys. He's the first missionary in Mark, out into the Gentile regions. And listen, some of you, we're a church plant. We've got a growing church plant within our church plant. It's awesome. In a church plant setting, sometimes we may want to do certain things or fill in certain roles, but we may be needed elsewhere. We may have to be plugged into something that's not our first choice. It may be our second, third, or way down the list choice. And what Jesus calls us to is to trust and obey. That's what he has for us in that season. We're called to trust and obey wherever God may call us, just like this man did. And as we close, I want you to see why. I want you to see why the Lord called this man to do this. It's amazing. See, back in chapter 1, do you remember, if you were here, we looked at Jesus and the leper. Jesus cleanses a leper at the end of chapter 1. But do you remember what Jesus asked him to do, or commanded him to do? He said, go to the priest, follow what you're supposed to do when you're cleansed, follow Levitical law, and don't tell anyone. Show yourself to the priest, but that's it. Well, what does the leper do? Complete opposite. He goes and he tells everybody. And you know what happens? He hinders Jesus' ministry in that town. Well, what happens here? This man, though he wants to be physically with Jesus, Jesus says no. And the man says, okay, Jesus, what do you want me to do? Go home and tell everyone about how the Lord has shown mercy to you. And he does. And by the way, with no training. This is something anyone can do. Go home and tell your story. But what about, justification by faith? What about sanctification? What about all these theological topics? Go tell your story. Anyone can do this. And he does. And you know what's neat about this? Where does he go? Verse 20, it tells us he began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. The Decapolis, that literally just means the 10 cities. It's a predominantly Gentile area, and you know what happens? When we get to chapter 7, Jesus is going to come back to this area. It tells us he went back to this region. And what do we see happen? People start recognizing Jesus because they start bringing people to him. They've heard about this Jesus. How did they hear? I'm willing to bet this man who was obedient to what Jesus called him to do. Did Jesus plant this man there at that time so that when he came back, the fields would be ripe for the harvest? I think so. How did he do it? This man shared his story of what the Lord had done for him, and we are called to do the same. Jesus calls us to proclaim the Lord's mercy toward us, to those around us. Just like the psalmist writes in Psalm 66, verse 16, this is what we're called to do. Come and hear, all you who fear God, and I will tell what he has done for my soul. That's what this man did. He told his story of how a legion of demons held him tight. But that was no match for Christ. He went and he told his story. What's your story? You might say, well, I wasn't, possessed by demons or whatever. That's okay. Tell your story of how the Lord has had mercy on you. Have you been set free from sin? Has Christ redeemed you? Has he set you free from the power of Satan? If not, trust in him today. And when you trust in him, then you can say with this healed man, and you can sing with the old hymn writer Charles Wesley, that Jesus breaks the power of canceled sin. He sets the prisoner free. His blood can make the foulest clean. His blood availed for me. I'm going to pray. I'm going to ask the worship team to remain seated because of the time, and then we'll go to the benediction. But let's go ahead and pray now. Our Father, we thank you for this wonderful story of this man who seemed so lost. Probably in the town's eyes, who could possibly help this man? They sent him far, far away, into the tombs, into the hills, where they'd be far away from him. He seemed hopeless, but not for you, not for Jesus. What remarkable power Jesus Christ has to set the prisoner free, to make the foulest clean. Father, help us to obey what you have called us to do, just like this man, to tell the world of your mercy toward us. We all have a story to tell, and so may we do that faithfully and obediently. We pray this in Christ's name.